Alex sat in the study, the silence of the grand house pressing down on him like a physical weight. The leather of the chair he occupied, a chair he had bought with the first significant bonus from his company, felt cold and unfamiliar. Outside, a relentless rain lashed against the windows, each drop a tiny hammer against the glass, mirroring the pounding in his own chest. He had rehearsed the words 100 times, yet they felt like stones in his throat. He heard the front door open and close, the sound sharp and dismissive. Footsteps clicked across the marble floor of the foyer, the rhythm impatient, hurried. It was Clara, his wife. She never walked, she proceeded, as if the world were a stage and she was its perpetually late star. He drew a slow, steadying breath, the air tasting of dust and regret. This was it, the moment everything would change. She appeared in the doorway of the study, not even bothering to look at him directly. Her phone was pressed to her ear, her face a mask of bored irritation. She was dressed in an elegant trench coat that probably cost more than his first car, her hair perfectly styled despite the storm. "No, Eleanor," she said into the phone, her voice dripping with disdain. "He's just sitting in there as usual, brooding." Alex felt a familiar pang of humiliation. To his wife, and to her mother Eleanor, he was not a man who thought, but a man who brooded. He was not pensive, but pathetic. He cleared his throat, a small, insignificant sound, but it was enough to make Clara finally lower her phone and fix her cold blue eyes on him. "What is it, Alex? I'm busy." "Clara," he began, his voice raspy, "we need to talk." She sighed, a theatrical exhalation of pure annoyance. "Can it wait? I have a charity gala committee meeting. We're deciding on the font for the invitations. It's terribly important." "No," he said, the word firmer than he expected. "It can't wait." He stood up, feeling strangely disconnected from his own body. He walked over to the mahogany liquor cabinet, his hand trembling slightly as he poured himself a glass of water. He needed something to hold on to. "It's about the company." Her interest was finally piqued. The company was the source of everything she valued, the house, the cars, the clothes, the status. It was the engine of her existence. "What about it?" she asked, a flicker of suspicion in her eyes. "Did you finally close that ridiculous deal with the Japanese firm? Eleanor says you're being too soft in the negotiations." Alex took a sip of water, the coolness doing nothing to quell the fire in his stomach. He looked at her, at the woman he had once loved with a devotion that now felt like a sickness. "The company's gone, Clara." She blinked, her perfectly sculpted eyebrows arching in confusion, not concern. "Gone? What do you mean, gone? Did you move the headquarters without telling me?" "I mean it's over," he said, the words coming out in a flat, dead tone he barely recognized as his own. "It's bankrupt. We've lost everything." For a long moment, she just stared at him. The silence stretched, filled only by the drumming of the rain. He watched her face, searching for a flicker of sympathy, a hint of shared loss, a single shred of compassion for the man who had worked himself to the bone for a decade to give her the life she demanded. He found nothing. Her expression shifted slowly, moving from confusion not to sadness, but to a pure, unadulterated rage. Her face, usually a carefully composed work of art, twisted into something ugly and cruel. "You're joking," she hissed, the words low and dangerous. "I wish I were," he whispered. "You're telling me," she said, taking a menacing step forward, "that the money is gone, all of it?" He could only nod, his throat closing up. Her reaction was not to cry or to comfort him. It was to act. She snatched the glass of water from his hand and, with a flick of her wrist, threw its contents in his face. The water was shockingly cold, a prelude to the icy storm that was about to break. "You incompetent fool!" she shrieked, her voice echoing in the cavernous room. "You pathetic, worthless failure!" Water dripped from his chin onto the expensive silk rug. He didn't move, didn't wipe his face. He just stood there, absorbing the blow, the final definitive confirmation of everything he had suspected for years. He was not her husband, he was her provider, and his services were no longer required. "Everything!" she screamed, her voice rising with hysteria. "My cars, my memberships, this house." "Everything," he repeated numbly. She stared at him, her chest heaving, her eyes burning with a hatred so profound it was almost impressive. Then she laughed. It was a terrible sound, sharp and brittle, like shattering glass. "Of course," she said, a cruel smile twisting her lips. "Of course you would fail. I should have seen it coming. You never had what it takes." She turned on her heel and stormed out of the study, pulling her phone back out. He heard her speed dialing as she walked away. "Mother," she said, her voice already regaining its composure, shifting from rage to calculated victimhood. "You are not going to believe what that useless husband of mine has done." Alex remained, standing there, dripping and defeated. His eyes drifted to a simple, framed photograph on the mantelpiece. It was a faded picture of him as a boy, standing proudly next to his grandfather on a plot of undeveloped land. His grandfather's arm was around his shoulder, his face etched with a kind, knowing wisdom. He could almost hear the old man's voice, a gentle rumble from a time long past. "A man's true worth isn't in his wallet, Alex," his grandfather used to say. "It's in his character, his integrity, but always, always make sure you own the ground you stand on." A single tear, indistinguishable from the water still clinging to his face, rolled down his cheek. The humiliation was a physical poison seeping into his bones, but beneath it, deep in the core of his being, something else was stirring, a cold, hard resolve. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one that was about to begin inside the walls of that house. The days that followed were a blur of calculated cruelty. Clara treated Alex not as a husband who had suffered a devastating loss, but as an inconvenient piece of furniture she was eager to discard. She spoke to him only in commands or insults, her words designed to chip away at what little dignity he had left. "Don't use the good towels," she would snap if she saw him coming from the master bathroom. "They're for guests. You can use the old ones in the laundry room." He had built his company, Apex Innovations, from nothing. It started in his parents' garage, a cliched origin story that was entirely true. He had poured his youth, his energy, and every waking moment into its creation. He had slept on the floor of his first office, lived off instant noodles, and coded until his fingers were numb and his vision blurred. Clara had entered his life when the company had just started to show promise. She was beautiful, sophisticated, and moved in circles he had only read about. He was instantly captivated, blinded by what he thought was love. He saw her as his reward for all the hard work, a sign that he had finally made it. He failed to see the truth. She was not in love with him. She was in love with his trajectory. She was a savvy investor, and her chosen asset was his future earning potential. For 10 years, she had reaped the dividends, lavish parties, exotic vacations, a wardrobe that filled 3 walk-in closets. She spent money as if it were an infinite resource, while he continued to work with the same desperate intensity as he had in the garage. Her mother, Eleanor, had never approved of him. She saw him as new money, crass and unrefined. She tolerated his presence only because he funded her daughter's extravagant lifestyle. Her phone calls became a daily ritual of torment. She would call Clara, who would put the phone on speaker, ensuring Alex could hear every venomous word. "I always knew he was a fraud," Eleanor's voice would crackle through the phone. "He has the ambition of a common labourer. I told you to marry Richard Sterling, Clara. At least his family has real old money. It doesn't just disappear overnight." Alex would sit in the guest room, the door closed, listening to them dissect his failure, his character, his very manhood. He ate his meals alone, simple sandwiches he made himself, while Clara ordered in from the city's most expensive restaurants, dining with friends who offered her performative sympathy while secretly reveling in the drama. The house, once his sanctuary, became a prison. Every object was a reminder of a life that was now a lie. The paintings on the wall, the sculptures in the garden, the Italian marble under his feet, he had paid for it all, but in Clara's eyes he no longer had any right to it. Less than a week after he had delivered the news, the final, unthinkable betrayal occurred. He was in the guest room, staring blankly at his laptop screen, when he heard a new voice in the house. A man's voice. It was deep and confident, laced with an easy arrogance. He crept to the door and listened. It was Julian, Clara's personal trainer from the country club. Alex had never liked him. Julian was a preening peacock of a man, all sculpted muscles and predatory smiles. He had always been a little too familiar with Clara, his hand lingering on her back a moment too long. "Don't you worry about a thing, baby," Julian was saying, his voice echoing from the living room. "I'm here now. We'll figure this out. You're too good to be dragged down by that loser." Alex felt the blood drain from his face. He heard Clara laugh, a light, flirtatious sound he hadn't heard from her in years. It was a sound she had never, not once, made for him. Later that day, she came to the guest room. She didn't bother to knock. She just opened the door and stood there, her arms crossed, a smug look on her face. Julian stood behind her, a proprietary arm draped around her shoulder. He was wearing one of Alex's own silk robes. "Alex," Clara said, her tone dripping with false sincerity. "Julian is going to be staying here for a while to help me through this difficult time." Alex stared at the man wearing his robe, standing in his house with his wife. The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking. It was a declaration of war. "He'll be staying in the master bedroom with me, of course," she continued, twisting the knife. "You can have this little room until you find some pathetic little apartment to crawl into. I think that's more than generous, don't you?" Julian smirked, looking Alex up and down with open contempt. "Yeah, man," he said, his voice a condescending drawl. "Be grateful. Clara's got a big heart." Alex didn't say a word. He just looked at them, his face a blank mask. He felt a strange calm settle over him, the kind of calm that comes when the worst has already happened. The pain was so immense it had become a clarifying force. There was no more confusion, no more hope, no more love. There was only the cold, hard truth of their characters laid bare for him to see. "This is my house now," Clara said, her voice turning sharp and final. "You're here on my charity. Don't forget it." She turned and left, Julian following like a loyal dog. The door clicked shut, leaving Alex alone in the suffocating silence. He walked to the window and looked out at the manicured lawn, the rose bushes he had planted himself. Her house. He pulled out his phone, his movements slow and deliberate. He scrolled through his contacts until he found the name he was looking for, Mr. Davies, his lawyer. A quiet, unassuming man with the mind of a chess grandmaster and the ethics of a shark when defending his clients. He had been Alex's grandfather's lawyer, and now he was Alex's. He pressed the call button. Davies answered on the first ring. "Alex," he said, his voice calm and professional. "I was wondering when you'd call. Is it time?" Alex watched as Julian strutted onto the patio, shirtless, flexing for Clara, who was lounging on a chaise. A wave of cold fury washed over him, cleansing him of the last vestiges of weakness. "Yes, Mr. Davies," Alex said, his voice low and steady. "It's time. Let's begin." The next morning, Alex dressed in a simple pair of jeans and a plain grey t-shirt, the uniform of his new, diminished status. He walked downstairs to find Clara and Julian in the kitchen, acting as if they were the lord and lady of the manor. Julian was making a protein shake in a blender that cost over $1,000, while Clara read a fashion magazine at the Marble Island. "Make sure you clean up after yourself," Clara said, without looking up from her magazine. "I won't have you leaving messes for the maid to deal with. We may have to let her go, thanks to you." Alex ignored her. He poured himself a cup of black coffee and walked out the back door. He sat on a small stone bench at the far end of the garden, the phone pressed to his ear. "Everything is in place," Mr. Davies was saying. "The final paperwork for the acquisition was signed last night. The funds will be transferred to the primary trust by noon today." "And the other matter?" Alex asked. His eyes fixed on the house. His house. "The deed is ironclad," Davies confirmed. "The property was purchased by the Northwood Land Trust, established by your grandfather in 1988. You were named the sole beneficiary on your 18th birthday. Her name does not appear on a single document related to its ownership. She has no claim, none whatsoever." Alex felt a grim satisfaction. His grandfather had been a shrewd man. He had seen the world for what it was and had taken steps to protect his own. He had protected Alex, even from beyond the grave. "She forced you to sign a prenuptial agreement, correct?" Davies asked. "Yes," Alex said. "She insisted, said it was to protect her family's assets, though they had none to speak of. It was about appearances." "I have a copy here," Davies said. "It's beautifully written. It explicitly states that all assets owned prior to the marriage and any assets derived from businesses owned prior to the marriage remain the sole and separate property of the individual owner. She essentially built a fortress around your wealth to keep herself out. The irony is delicious." Alex allowed himself a small, bitter smile. Clara's greed and arrogance had become the instruments of her own undoing. He spent the rest of the day in a small private office Mr. Davies had arranged for him downtown. It was a sterile, anonymous space, but it felt more like home than his own house did. On the large mahogany desk, Davies laid out a series of folders, each one representing a pillar of the life Clara had built for herself. "This," Davies said, tapping the first folder, "is the central account, the Clara and Alex Monroe joint account. It is, of course, funded entirely by transfers from your corporate holding company. As of this morning, that holding company is a shell. The assets have been moved. The account's source of funding is gone." He opened the folder to reveal a statement with a balance that made Alex's head spin. "The first step," Davies said, "is to sever her access. As the primary account holder, you have the right to freeze all cards and credit lines associated with it, effective immediately." The second folder contained the lease agreements for Clara's 2 luxury cars. The third held the details of her memberships at the country club, the yacht club, and a half-dozen other exclusive organizations. All were paid for automatically from the joint account. "Once the account is frozen, the automatic payments will fail," Davies explained, his voice clinical. "The default notices will follow within days. The dominoes will begin to fall." The final folder was the thickest. It was labeled 125 Northwood Lane. Inside was the deed, the trust documents, and a pristine, freshly printed eviction notice. "This is the coup de grace," Davies said, sliding the notice across the table. "We will have it served by a court-appointed process server tomorrow morning. She will have 30 days to vacate the premises, as will her guest." Alex picked up the pen. It felt heavy in his hand, a scepter of power he had forgotten he possessed. He looked at the documents, at the cold, hard print that would dismantle a decade of lies. He thought of Clara's sneer, of Julian wearing his robe, of Eleanor's voice calling him a failure. There was no hesitation. His signature was a firm, angry slash across the page. He made the phone call to the bank manager himself, his voice calm and authoritative. He authorized the freeze on every card, every line of credit. He cut the cord. "It is done," he said to Davies, hanging up the phone. "The plan is in motion," the lawyer confirmed. "Now we wait, and we watch." Alex returned to the house that evening and retreated to the guest room. He felt like a spy in his own life, an undercover agent gathering intelligence before a final raid. He could hear Clara and Julian in the living room, laughing as they watched a movie on the state-of-the-art home theater system he had designed. They were oblivious, living in the final moments of their fool's paradise. The first domino fell the next afternoon. Alex was reading in the guest room when he heard Clara's shriek of outrage from downstairs. It was a sound he knew well, the cry of an empress whose decree had been inexplicably ignored. He crept to the top of the stairs to listen. She was on the phone, her voice a shrill weapon. "What do you mean, declined?" she was yelling. "I was at Cartier. I was buying Julian a little something. Try it again. It's a black card, for heaven's sake. There is no limit." There was a pause. Alex could picture her tapping her foot impatiently, her face contorted in a mask of indignation. "Frozen!" she shrieked, her voice cracking. "By whom? Alex! That's impossible! He doesn't have the authority! He's a bankrupt loser! Put your manager on the phone right now!" The frantic, panicked energy coming from downstairs was intoxicating. Alex felt a surge of cold, vindictive pleasure. He had been a ghost in this house for a week, a powerless observer of his own humiliation. Now he was the puppeteer, and Clara was finally dancing to his tune. He heard her slam the phone down. Then came the sound of things being thrown. A vase shattered against a wall. He pictured the scene with grim satisfaction. Julian's voice, trying to be soothing, was met with a volley of curses. She called Alex's phone, but he let it go to voicemail. She left a string of messages, each one more unhinged than the last. They started as furious commands to fix this mess, and quickly devolved into venomous tirades, blaming him for her public embarrassment. "You did this on purpose to humiliate me," she screamed in the final message. "You are the most selfish, pathetic man I have ever known. I hate you." The next morning, the second domino fell. Alex was looking out the guest room window when a nondescript sedan pulled into the long, winding driveway. A man in a cheap suit got out, holding a large manila envelope, the process server. Clara answered the door, still in her pajamas, her face puffy from crying or rage, or both. The man said a few words, handed her the envelope, and left. Clara stared at it, confused. She tore it open right there on the doorstep. Alex watched as the color drained from her face. She read the document, her hands shaking. She read it again, her mouth hanging open in disbelief. Then she looked up, her wild eyes scanning the front of the house, the stone facade, the towering columns, as if seeing it for the first time, as if realizing it was not and had never been hers. She crumpled to her knees on the welcome mat, the legal papers scattering around her. A guttural sob, a sound of pure animal despair, was torn from her throat. It was the most honest sound he had ever heard her make. The cascade accelerated. The day after the eviction notice arrived, a flatbed truck came for her white convertible. She stood on the lawn, screaming at the driver, threatening to sue him, his company, and everyone they had ever known. The man simply showed her the repossession order and continued his work. Julian, who had been a strutting peacock just days before, was now a nervous pigeon. He saw the world he had married into crumbling around him. The endless supply of money was gone, the fancy car was gone, the security of the mansion was a ticking clock. Alex maintained his facade of ignorance and despair. When Clara would confront him, waving a credit card statement or a default notice in his face, he would just shrug helplessly. "I told you, Clara," he would say, his voice a monotone of feigned defeat. "It's all gone. The creditors are taking everything." Her rage, unable to find purchase on his placid surface, turned on Julian. The argument started, hushed and vicious at first, then escalating into full-blown shouting matches that echoed through the house. She blamed him for being there, for being a witness to her downfall. He blamed her for lying about her wealth. The country club called to inform her that her membership had been suspended due to non-payment. Her circle of friends suddenly stopped answering her calls. The edifice of her social standing, built on the fragile foundation of Alex's money, had collapsed in on itself. She was a pariah. Alex watched it all from a distance, a silent observer in the ruins of his former life. He packed a single, small suitcase. He didn't need any of the expensive clothes or possessions that filled the house. They were relics of a life he no longer wanted, a person he no longer was. He was traveling light into his new future. The final day of the 30-day notice arrived with a cold, brilliant clarity. The sky was a piercing blue, and the autumn air was crisp. It was a perfect day for a reckoning. Alex did not return to the house in his usual uniform of defeat. He arrived in a chauffeured black sedan, the kind Clara had always insisted on using. He stepped out wearing a bespoke charcoal suit perfectly tailored, exuding an aura of quiet, unshakable authority. He was not alone. Mr. Davies was by his side, carrying a sleek leather briefcase. Two large, impassive men in dark suits, clearly professional security, stood behind them. On the lawn, a fleet of moving trucks was already parked. A team of movers was efficiently and carefully removing furniture from the house, but it was not Clara's furniture. It was Alex's. The art he had chosen, the books he had collected, the desk from his study. Clara and Julian stood on the porch, their faces a mixture of defiance and panic. They were surrounded by a mountain of designer luggage, a pathetic testament to a life of excess they could no longer afford. "What is the meaning of this?" Clara shrieked as Alex approached, her voice thin and reedy. "You can't do this. The notice said we had until 5 o'clock. "It is 3 o'clock, Clara," Alex said, his voice calm and even. It cut through the atmosphere like a blade. "I am merely getting a head start on reclaiming my property. These men are here to ensure the transition is a smooth one." He gestured to the security guards. "Your property?" Julian scoffed, trying to regain some of his lost swagger. "You have nothing. You're a broke joke." Alex ignored him completely, his eyes locked on Clara. "You seem to be under a number of misapprehensions," he said. He took a step closer, forcing her to look up at him. The power dynamic had irrevocably shifted. He was no longer the brooding failure in the guest room. He was the master of this universe, and she was merely a trespasser. "You can't kick me out!" she screamed, her composure finally shattering. "This is my home. I have rights." "No, you don't," Mr. Davies said, stepping forward. He opened his briefcase and produced a single, crisp document. "This is the deed to the property, held in trust for Mr. Monroe since before you were ever married. Your name appears nowhere on it. Legally, you were never more than a guest here, a guest whose invitation has now been rescinded." Clara stared at the paper, her mind unable to process the words. "But the bankruptcy," she stammered. "The company. You lost everything." Alex allowed a cold, hard smile to touch his lips. This was the moment he had been waiting for. the culmination of all the pain, the humiliation, the betrayal. It was time for the great reveal. "You spent 10 years treating me like a machine," he began, his voice low, but carrying with deadly precision. "A machine designed for the sole purpose of funding your empty life. You mocked my work, you despised my family, and you flaunted your affairs in my own home." He took another step, his presence dominating the space between them. "The moment you thought the money was gone, the very second you perceived me as weak, you threw me away like a piece of trash. You moved your boy toy into my bed and told me I should be grateful to sleep in the guest room." He paused, letting the weight of his words hang in the air. Julian shifted uncomfortably. Clara's face was a pale mask of dawning horror. "But what you didn't know, Clara," he said, delivering the final devastating blow, "is that the business never failed. It was never bankrupt." He let that sink in. "I sold it," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "to a multinational tech conglomerate. The deal was finalized a month ago. I didn't lose everything. In fact, I am now worth over $300 million. The world seemed to stop. The movers paused. The wind died down. The only sound was the sharp, ragged intake of Clara's breath. Her face cycled through a series of emotions with comical speed: confusion, disbelief, a flicker of greedy hope, and finally, pure animalistic terror as the full implications of her actions crashed down upon her. My money," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. "Half of that is mine. I'm your wife." Mr. Davies stepped forward again, a grim executioner delivering the final verdict. "Not for much longer," he said, pleasantly. He produced another set of documents from his briefcase and handed them to her. "These are divorce papers. We are filing on the grounds of adultery. We have extensive evidence." He then handed her one final sheet of paper. "And this," he said, "is a copy of the prenuptial agreement you yourself insisted upon signing, the one that protects all of Mr. Monroe's business assets and any proceeds derived therefrom. You, quite brilliantly, signed away any claim to this fortune years ago." Clara looked at the papers in her hand as if they were venomous snakes. Her body began to tremble, a low whimper escaping her lips. She looked up at Alex, her eyes pleading for the first time in their entire marriage. "Alex, no," she begged. "Please, I made a mistake. I was scared. I love you." The words were so hollow, so transparently false, that Alex could only laugh. It was a short, sharp, humorless sound. "Love?" he said. "You don't know the meaning of the word. You love money, Clara, and your access to mine has just been permanently revoked." Julian, seeing his golden goose was not just cooked, but vaporized, began to back away slowly, trying to detach himself from the screaming, crying woman who was his now bankrupt and homeless girlfriend. "Hey, man, I had nothing to do with this," he said, raising his hands. "I was just—" "You were just what?" Alex said, turning his cold gaze on him. "A parasite? An opportunist? Don't worry, Julian. My lawyer will be in touch with yours. I'm sure we can find something to sue you for. Emotional distress, perhaps." The two security guards moved, silently and efficiently, to block Julian's exit. He was trapped. Clara completely broke down. She fell to her knees, screaming, sobbing, pounding her fists on the stone steps of the porch. It was a tantrum of epic proportions, the desperate, ugly breakdown of a narcissist who had just lost everything and knew, with sickening certainty, that it was entirely her own fault. Alex watched her for a moment longer, feeling nothing but a profound and final emptiness. There was no joy in her suffering, only a quiet, grim closure. The woman he had married had died long ago. This was just the exorcism of her ghost. He turned his back on the scene, on the ruins of his past. He walked towards the waiting sedan, his posture straight, his steps firm. "Mr. Davies," he said over his shoulder, not bothering to look back. "Please have them off my property within the hour. Call the police for trespassing if you must." He got into the car without a backward glance. As the driver pulled away, the last thing he saw in the rearview mirror was the pathetic tableau of Clara and Julian, two vultures left with nothing but the bones of their own greed. The long driveway stretched out before him, a road leading to a future that was, for the first time in a very long time, entirely his own. The aftermath was swift and total. Clara, left with only the designer clothes on her back and a mountain of debt, was forced to move into her mother Eleanor's cramped condominium. The news of her spectacular social implosion spread like wildfire through the circles she had once dominated. She became a cautionary tale, a subject of gossip and ridicule. Her friends treated her like a leper. The shame was her constant companion. Julian, faced with a lawsuit he could not afford to fight, disappeared. Alex's lawyers later discovered he had moved to another state, likely in search of another wealthy, insecure woman to leech from. Alex didn't pursue the lawsuit. Julian was no longer worth the effort. His banishment was punishment enough. Alex, however, did not embrace the extravagant lifestyle that his new fortune afforded him. He had seen firsthand how wealth could corrupt and distort, how it could become a prison of its own. He sold the grand, empty house on Northwood Lane, a place now tainted with bitter memories. The proceeds from the sale were the first deposit into a new, charitable foundation he established. The Monroe Foundation for Young Innovators was his new passion. He dedicated his time and resources to finding and funding the next generation of dreamers working out of their own garages, ensuring they had the support they needed without losing their integrity along the way. He found more satisfaction in a single successful startup than he had in all the years of accumulating wealth for Clara's benefit. He moved into a modest but beautiful home overlooking the ocean, a place of peace and solitude. He reconnected with the simple things he had long forgotten, reading books, hiking in the mountains, learning to cook. He was rediscovering the man he had been before Apex Innovations, before Clara. It was during this period of quiet rediscovery that he met Sarah. She owned a small, independent coffee shop in the nearby coastal town, a cozy place filled with the scent of roasted beans and old books. He went there one morning to read, and they struck up a conversation. She was kind, intelligent, and funny, with a warmth that seemed to radiate from her. She had no idea who he was or how much money he had, and he made no effort to tell her. She was interested in his thoughts on the book he was reading, not the balance in his bank account. For the first time in over a decade, he felt seen for who he was, not what he possessed. Their relationship grew slowly, naturally, built on a foundation of shared values and mutual respect. He would help her in the coffee shop on busy weekends, finding a simple joy in the act of making a perfect latte or talking with the regular customers. She, in turn, would listen with genuine interest as he spoke about the young entrepreneurs his foundation was supporting. One evening, they were walking along the beach, the sun setting over the Pacific in a blaze of orange and purple. The waves crashed gently against the shore, a soothing, eternal rhythm. "You seem so at peace," Sarah said, slipping her hand into his. "Like you've been through a great storm and have finally found your harbor." Alex looked out at the horizon, a genuine smile gracing his lips. He thought of the cold, rain-swept night in the study, of the humiliation and betrayal. It all felt like a lifetime ago, a scene from someone else's story. He had not just survived the storm, he had become the captain of his own ship, navigating by the stars of his own values. He finally told her everything, the whole sordid story of his marriage, the deception, the downfall, and the fortune. He laid his past bare, trusting her with his vulnerability. She listened patiently, her expression never changing. When he was finished, she simply squeezed his hand. "Money doesn't change who you are, Alex," she said softly. "It just magnifies it. You were always a good man. You just forgot for a little while." In that moment, he knew he had found his true wealth. It wasn't in the 9-figure bank account or the successful foundation. It was here, in this simple, honest connection with another human being. It was in the peace he felt in his own soul. A final scene unfolded in his mind. Clara, sitting in her mother's beige, joyless living room, endlessly scrolling through pictures of her old life on social media, her face a permanent mask of bitter resentment. She was trapped in a prison of her own making, forever mourning the golden cage she had so carelessly destroyed. True power, Alex realized, lay not in what we can acquire, but in what we are willing to let go of. He had let go of the anger, the pain, and the need for validation from a world that didn't matter. In doing so, he had gained everything. He had won. Not by crushing his enemies, but by building a life they could never comprehend, a life of purpose, peace, and quiet, unshakable joy.